December 7th, 1941, was a long day for Hawaii. Although the Japanese attack had occurred that morning, for some time following the departure of the last Japanese plane, explosions still erupted across Honolulu, 10 miles from Pearl Harbor. Why? Was this the work of delayed fuses? Secret saboteur sleeper cells? It turns out the answer is far more tragic. Over 60 civilians were killed in Honolulu that day, mostly as a result of American artillery, not Japanese bombs. To find out the how and the why, we must look at how American soldiers and sailors tried to defend themselves when the attack began. It is fairly well known that on the day of the attack, a Sunday, the base was in an almost ideal state of unreadiness of attack. The planes were packed together on the runway in a tight formation to better guard against sabotage, and the ammunition of the anti-aircraft guns were locked away and not easily accessible. Ironically, the base had gone through extensive live ammunition practice for a week beforehand, but the commander of the base had thought his men deserved a day of rest and had packed it all up. The end result of this, of course, was that the Japanese initial raid caused much damage with very little to answer for it. Left with no other means to defend themselves, panicking sailors aboard the ships in the harbor began to fire their ship's guns at approaching planes. These included both dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns that could fire at planes, and large ship's cannons that were meant to fire only at other ships miles away. The problem with the latter is probably obvious. The chance of hitting a small, fast-moving plane with a slow-moving gun is incredibly remote, and, as many smaller-scale tragedies over the years have shown, firing a bullet into the air does not make it disappear into space. It has to come down somewhere. That does not mean that anti-aircraft guns were safe either. Many, understandably panicked sailors ignored their training and rammed their ammunition into their guns as quickly as possible, aiming right at the attacking planes, as if they were at a rifle range. This posed two problems. Early war American anti-aircraft guns operated by setting a timer on the shell before firing it. If the gunner calculated his timing correctly, the timer would go off when the shell had traveled the correct distance upward, hitting the plane. In their haste to get something into the sky, the shell's timers were not set, meaning that they would just explode on impact. And since you must aim where a plane will be by the time your projectile reaches the same spot in order to hit it, firing directly at where the plane is now means that the plane will have zoomed past long ago by the time your projectile arrives. It would hit nothing, and, like the shells from the naval cannons, fall back to Earth. One of the biggest rules of gun safety is to know what is behind your target. If you are at a range and you miss your target, you want to make sure that there is nothing you don't want hit behind it. Unfortunately, the city of Honolulu, itself not attacked by Japanese planes, was well within the range of these errant shots from American warships. The biggest of the shells that would bombard Honolulu were 80 pounds, an 80-pound explosive crashing into the streets and buildings of the Hawaiian capital and exploding. To put that in terms more of us can understand, let's look at a recent example. In 2021, an excited couple in New Hampshire decided to give their newborn and their friends a gender reveal party to remember. They bought 80 pounds of tannerite, an over-the-counter explosive, and took it out to a local quarry to set it off. The resulting explosion was so large that it registered as an earthquake and was heard in the neighboring state. Police said that much explosive could devastate a home. The explosives used by the Navy in 1941 had roughly twice the power of tannerite. Contemporary newspaper reports tell of entire houses being destroyed in Honolulu neighborhoods. To give an example from one reported case, a family took their mother to the hospital after she had been struck by an anti-aircraft shell fragment that had penetrated their basement. Tragically, their mother died on the way to the hospital. When they returned, though, the family found that their entire house had been destroyed by naval fire. Long after the Japanese returned to their carriers, nervous sailors continued to fire at anything and nothing. Accounts published during the London Blitz tell of anti-air gunners firing at nothing, comforted by the mere fact that they were making noise. While this reaction is understandable, it resulted in further damage and death throughout the morning. In a final tragic footnote to this colossal friendly fire incident, 6 American planes that were sent out that morning to locate the Japanese fleet were returning to base. The airfield had been well informed that the planes were coming in, and were Americans, but Terrified sailors in the fading light of evening opened fire. 5 of the 6 planes were shot down, and 3 pilots were killed. In the words of author Simon Webb, it was a terrible coda to one of the worst cases of friendly fire ever seen in American territory, one which had left more than 60 civilians dead from artillery fire from their own side. The soldiers and sailors who died in the attack deserve all the attention that they receive, and recognizing the tragic story of others who died does not lessen their sacrifice. But we should not forget those who died, whose deaths tarnish our clean narrative of universal competence and heroics against horrific barbarity. People in history are humans too, and mistakes were still made. Not all deaths were the result of enemy bombs. The American bombardment of Honolulu is a sad event and a complicated story, and we would do well to remember the tragic death of those 68.